This world that we all call home is a planet in upheaval. Across the US and around the world, everywhere we look, there is turmoil and chaos. Some is nature going to the extreme, and some is man-made. All of it leaving a wake of ashes and dust. National and world leaders have little to no answers and actually spend more time blaming each other than they do trying to find adequate answers to the problems we face. But there are answers. Answers that will not be found by human devising, but rather are contained upon the pages of the Bible. Join us as In the Scriptures, in association with the ministry Voice of Prophecy, presents Discovering Revelation, coming to you from Murphy, North Carolina. And now, here's your host, Pastor Craig Fish.
There was a time, believe it or not, that what we're going to look at this evening was something that really the overwhelming bulk of Christianity not only knew but understood quite clearly. But it's really in the last 150 years or so that there's actually been a tremendous amount of confusion about this topic. And I believe that it's understandably so. Satan knows when things are going to happen. He might not necessarily know exactly when they're going to happen or exactly how they're going to play out, but he knows the Bible quite well. And he also knows kind of a roundabout kind of times when things would happen. And he knows how to muddy the waters for people around those times. For example, we already looked at Daniel chapter 7, and we saw how the 70 weeks prophecy was pointing to the coming of the Messiah and his messianic ministry, and then the gospel message going out to the rest of the world. During that time, leading up to that moment, one of the things that the devil did is he brought other people along, and we even see this referred to in the Bible, who claimed to be the Christ. The people were getting to this point where they were hoping for a Christ who would come, who would free them from the Romans and put them back on top of the world, if you will. That's what they were looking for. They were looking for a military leader who would establish them as a power, if you will. But that was not the mission of the Christ. But what Satan did is he knew what the people wanted. He knew about the time the Christ was going to be coming, so he influenced individuals to take it upon themselves with an overzealous religious perspective to take that role upon themselves, but they ended up being false messiahs, and every single one of them died. But they confused the people. They disparaged the people because every person who came up to be this Messiah all failed. So when the true Messiah came, nobody was ready. There are other things that we can look at as well. We talked about the 2,300 days from Daniel 8:24, and we noticed how this isn't something that refers to a small, obscure Grecian king way back 200 years before Christ himself, but rather it pointed far forward into the future to the year 1844. Well, Satan also understood this, and about that same time, Satan also began to muddy the waters with other movements that were going on as well. So again, the truth of what God's Bible was pointing to became muddied with other things that were happening to distract the people. Well, friends, the same thing is going to happen with what we're going to look at tonight. Satan knows, he understands better than anybody else that he has a short time and that his time is almost up. And he understands the topic that we're going to look at quite well. And he also knows that one of the greatest strategies that he has is diversion. There's nothing quite like a good diversionary tactic. It's used in almost every sports game that you can think of, where you create a diversion in one area of a field only to make the play somewhere else. You get the defense to look in the wrong place so that you can score using something else. That is his tactic. But friends, we are cutting through the deception of Satan tonight so that you can see exactly what the Protestant reformers knew several hundred years ago, were teaching their people, but there was a turn that changed people's minds over time, and today there is tremendous amounts of confusion about this topic. Why would that be? Well, let's take some time to dig into this and see what it is that we have in the Bible. Revelation chapter 13 tells us about two beasts. We're going to look at the first one tonight. One comes out of the sea, one comes out of the earth. We'll look at the one that comes out of the earth, or the land, if you will, on another night. But tonight we're going to focus on that one that comes out of the sea. Now, some things that we have to understand about this, and you'll see this as we go. Attached to that beast power that comes out of the sea, that first one in Revelation 13, is also that number 666, the mark of the beast. There have been numerous interpretations of what that has been. There have been people who thought that Ronald Reagan was the beast because he had Ronald Wilson Reagan. 3 names, each name had 6 letters, 666. Now, of course, he's dead and gone, so he couldn't have been the Antichrist. Then there were people who thought that Barack Obama was the Antichrist. Well, of course, he's out of power, so he can't be the Antichrist either. And so one of the constant changes is now they have to find somebody else to kind of pin the tail on the Antichrist, if you will. All the while, they just keep looking for the wrong thing if those are the kinds of things they're looking for. So what is it that we're going to do tonight? We are going to expose what the scriptures have to say about who and what this beast power is, and we are going to get into no uncertain terms of exactly what we're talking about. But there are 2 conditions that we have to do before we have to agree upon before we get into this. And one is this: no jumping to conclusions. Don't go try and getting ahead of me. I used to work in a call center where I would take phone calls for various nationwide ministries. And I would talk to people from all over the country on a regular basis. And one of the things that I found to be very true many times is I would ask questions of people when they would call stating some position that they had. And rather than actually answering the question that I would ask them, they would answer what they thought I was asking or where they thought I was trying to go with the question. 99.9% of the time, they were always mistaken. Why? Because you can't read my mind, and I can't read your mind. So they would try to think, oh, now I know where this guy's going to go with this question, so I'm going to answer where I think he's trying to go. But they would never get it right. And they would always go off into another direction without ever really knowing where we were going. They would jump to conclusions and miss the whole point. Now, the Bible actually has something to say about this. The Bible says that a fool answers without hearing the whole matter. So tonight I'm going to ask you to hear the whole matter. Don't jump to conclusions, even though you may figure it out ahead of time. Hold on and don't jump to conclusions. The second thing that I would like for us to keep in mind is that we have got to keep our eyes on Christ. Above all else, Christ is our target. So with those 2 conditions in mind, let's get right into our study. And I stood upon the sand of the sea and saw a beast rise up out of the sea, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and upon his horns 10 crowns, and upon his heads the names of blasphemy. And I saw one of his heads as if it were wounded to death, and his deadly wound was healed, and all the world wondered after the beast. Here's our evidence. We're going to start to unpack this now. So our first big clue is that this creature comes out of the sea. Now, if you read the whole Bible, it's pretty easy to figure out what exactly the sea means. Aside from being a reference to the Mediterranean, that's really an important part if you think about it, but it's beyond just the Mediterranean. Revelation chapter 17 gives us something quite clear. Then he said to me, the waters which you saw, where the harlot sits, are peoples, multitudes, nations, and tongues. So in Revelation chapter 17, we see something there that is actually very closely linked to what we're seeing in Revelation 13. Also in Revelation 17, there's this beast with 7 heads. But on the back of this particular beast in Revelation 17, there's this harlot who's dressed in purple. And that is all very important. But there's also this sea that's involved there. But here, the angel tells us exactly what the sea represents. It's a representation of largely populated areas. And this is exactly what it is that John is looking at. This beast comes out of a populated area. And we're going to see exactly why it is that this is pertinent shortly. Now, actually, believe it or not, the Jews, believe it or not, referred to the Gentile nations around them as the sea. And they saw themselves as this kind of a little island in the midst of the sea. So again, part of what we have to do is understand the scriptures in their original context. So according to the Jewish people of the first century, they would have understood this imagery of a sea as being populous areas. That's exactly how they would have understood it, and that's exactly how we should understand it today as well. This isn't something where we should be looking for some creature to literally come out of the ocean like it's going to be some kind of nuclear submarine that's going to launch missiles or something and destroy a dozen cities all at once. That's not what this is talking about. This is talking about something that the people of the first century would have understood in particular ways. So let's keep going and see what else we have in store for us. We actually see these same animals that are described here, the lion, the leopard, and the bear, described elsewhere. You remember from Daniel chapter 8, we looked at the vision there, and there was a goat and a ram, and there was this horn that was involved in all that. Well, let's take a moment and back up just a little bit to see what else is connected with that vision of Daniel 8. We're actually going to go to Daniel chapter 7. Daniel spoke, saying, I saw in my vision by night, and behold, the four winds of heaven were stirring upon the great sea. Four great beasts came up from the sea, each different from the other. Those great beasts, which are four kings, which shall arise out of the earth. So first of all, we know that the beasts that come out of the water, these represent kings. They represent political powers, but they actually represent a little bit more than that as well, as we're about to see in the very next thing that we're going to look at. So first of all, each creature represents a king, but it's more than just a king. Look at what else we have here. Thus he said, the fourth beast shall be a fourth kingdom on the earth. So it's more than just a king that's being represented. It's a kingdom. It's a nation that each one of these things is representing. So it's more than just a single individual. It's a national power that each of these animals represents. And really, Bible prophecy uses animals quite often to represent various powers. It's really a very simple thing to do. And we do the exact same thing today. For example, we use an eagle to represent the United States. There's a bear that's used to represent Russia. There's a lion that's used to represent Great Britain. And other nations, I think a beaver is used, to represent Canada. Now, I might be wrong about that, so if you're Canadian and you're watching this and I got that wrong, please forgive me. I'm admittedly not up on all the animals and what nations used what animals to represent them. However, we also have to remember that just because different nations use different animals today does not mean that when we see those animals referred to in Bible prophecy that it's referring to those very same nations, and we'll see why in just a moment. So now Daniel 7 goes into some detail, and then Daniel 8 covers that kind of detail again. But you remember from Daniel chapter 2, that head of gold was Babylon, the chest and arms were Medo-Persia, who defeated the Babylonians, the belly and thighs of brass or bronze, depending on what version of Bible you might have, was Greece, the legs of iron were Rome, and then the feet of iron and clay was the dividing of Rome. Now, when we get into Daniel chapter 8, this ram with the two horns, one being bigger than the other one, and the bigger one coming up afterwards, this represented the Medo-Persians. We're even told that right in the vision. Then there's this goat with this notable horn that comes along, and he defeats the ram. This is the Greeks under Alexander the Great. He dies. His empire is divided amongst his four generals, and eventually they war against each other and kill off two of those regions, and then it's just the Seleucids and the Ptolemies who battle back and forth for a while until Rome comes and basically settles the whole argument. Which exactly what we see happen there in Daniel 8 is when the Roman Empire comes along, represented by this horn in both its united and its divided state, because there is a shift that occurs during the time of the Roman Empire. This is why the single horn represents both phases of the Roman Empire. But now we're going to look at something else from Daniel chapter 7. The first was like a lion and had eagle's wings. I watched till its wings were plucked off, and it was lifted up from the earth and made to stand on 2 feet like a man, and a man's heart was given to it. So now, there is no direct interpretation of what these animals mean. However, there is enough information here that we can figure out exactly what these things are talking about. For example, Daniel 7 is reflecting Daniel 2, but it's giving different details from a different perspective. Now, how can I know this? Well, first of all, this is, if you remember, it's very consistent. We have to use very consistent logic when we're applying these things. The times that the prophet lives in, like Daniel or like John, when they're talking about apocalyptic prophecy is what God has said, this is just simply what's going to happen. There's conditional prophecy, and then there is apocalyptic prophecy. Conditional prophecy is if you do this, this is what happens, but if you do this, then this is what will happen. It's also called covenant prophecy. Apocalyptic prophecy is simply God saying, it doesn't matter what you do, this is what's going to happen. Daniel and Revelation fall into that category of apocalyptic prophecy. This kind of prophecy begins in the day that the prophet lives, and we see this consistently through the Bible. Daniel is alive in the time of Babylon. So how can I say then that the lion with wings represents Babylon? Well, first of all, when we look at the ruins of the ancient city of Babylon, in fact, this is a picture of a relief actually from Nebuchadnezzar's palace. And what is it? It's a lion with wings. Now, the wings that we see there actually represent swiftness. Now, how is it that I can know that? Well, first of all, we see that this image is very prominent throughout the city of Babylon. But the Bible also gives us some additional details about that swiftness. Now, Nebuchadnezzar took the kingdom that his father Nebuchadnezzar had created. Nebuchadnezzar is the one who made it a superpower, and he did it pretty fast. Now, how can we know that the wings represent swiftness? Is it just looking at Nebuchadnezzar's success, or does the Bible give us details? Well, Habakkuk chapter 1, verse 8 tells us that when the Chaldeans, the Babylonians, would invade Israel, they would do it with the speed of an eagle as it hastens to eat. Hastens, speedily. Then also in Jeremiah 4, verse 13, it says that the horses of the Babylonians were swifter than eagles. So both of those are things that show us how wings represent swiftness, rapidness, if you will. But what is it that comes after the Babylonians? And suddenly another beast, a second, like a bear, it was raised up on one side and had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth. And they said thus to it, arise, devour much flesh. So, who is it that came after the Babylonians? It was the Medo-Persians. The Medo-Persians were represented as the chest and arms of silver, and now they're being represented as this bear with the 3 ribs. Now, I know that there are people who say, no, the bear represents Russia. Friends, that's not correct at all. This has absolutely nothing to do with Russia. This has to do with the Medo-Persians. Notice how the chest and arms, there's 2 arms, the Medes and the Persians. 2 nations. They had a coalition together. But the bear gives some additional details. Just like the ram had 2 horns, but one was bigger than the other, and the bigger one came up afterwards. And that's exactly what happened with the Medo-Persians. Now notice this bear is also raised up on one side. That's because the Persians, the Medes were there first, the Persians came along, but the Persians became stronger than the Medes over time. And so when we see this ram with the horns, the one horn is bigger than the other, that's because that's exactly what we see happen in history. This bear also represents the exact same thing. One side is higher or stronger than the other. And then there's these 3 ribs in its mouth. What could that possibly be? Well, the Medo-Persian coalition, when they defeated Babylon, they actually defeated 3 main provinces. It was Babylon, Egypt, and Syria. They took those 3 things out, or Assyria, I'm sorry. And that's what's represented by those 3 ribs in the mouth of the bear. So let's take a look at this next animal. And this one is really strange. You don't see this one in your zoo most often. After this, I looked, and there was another, like a leopard, which had on its back 4 wings of a bird. The beast also had 4 heads, and dominion was given to it. Now think about that. A leopard with 4 heads and 4 wings. Well, who is it that came after the Medo-Persians? The Medo-Persians defeated the Babylonians. The Greeks defeated the Medo-Persians. Now, again, think about those wings. We see already how they represent swiftness. So if Nebuchadnezzar did his job pretty fast, Alexander the Great did it even faster, and he covered much more territory in a much shorter period of time than Nebuchadnezzar did. And of course, as we've already said, when Nebuchadnezzar died, or when Alexander the Great died, 4 generals took over the empire that he had established. Hence we have 4 wings representing great swiftness of the Greeks, and 4 heads representing the 4 generals that would take over after Alexander the Great passed away. So we see this very same thing in the goat that is represented in Daniel chapter 8. the big horn that comes, defeats the ram, pushes every direction it wants to go, and nobody could stop it. But then when it becomes strong, the big horn is broken off and 4 horns come up in its place. Exactly the same thing, just using slightly different imagery. So what can we say then but that this leopard represents Greece? And what is it that would come after the Greeks? After this, I saw in the night visions, and behold, a 4th beast, dreadful and terrible, exceedingly strong. It had huge iron teeth. It was devouring, breaking in pieces, and trampling the residue with its feet. It was different from all the beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns. Now, pause for just a moment and think about the details that we just read about. It's not too hard to put this one together. What kind of teeth was this beast just described as having? They were iron teeth. How many horns is it described as having? It's 10 horns. So what could this possibly tell us, but rather that this 4th beast that comes up, being a 4th kingdom, as we read earlier, is also the empire of Rome, represented by the iron legs of Daniel chapter 2. And those 10 horns, of course, are also the 10 divisions of the Western Roman Empire. So you have 10 kingdoms that come out of the Western Roman Empire. So how do I know this? Well, it's because the Bible says so. Look here at what it says shortly after this. The 10 horns are 10 kings who shall arise from this kingdom. Now remember how we already saw, king and kingdom are synonymous. It's 10 nations that would rise out of this single power. And that, friends, is exactly what we saw happen in history. There were barbarian tribes who came along, who started whittling little pieces of the empire out for themselves. And this is something that we looked at on our first night. But let's just take a brief look at it once again. Here we have this map of Europe as we know of it. Up there in that purple you have the Anglo-Saxons. They were the British or the English. The Visigoths down here where it's a little bit tan, they became like the Spaniards. You had the Suevi, they became the Portuguese. Over there where it says Heruli, well that's Italy, they became the Italians. Where it says the Franks, they became the French, and on and on. I'm not going to go through all of these names. And you see the Vandals, they were there in North Africa. So these were the divisions of the Western Roman Empire. But take a look at what else we see happen, also recorded in Daniel chapter 7. I was considering the horns, and there was another horn, a little one, coming up among them, before whom 3 of the first horns were plucked out by the roots. And there, in this horn, were eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth speaking pompous words. So first of all, we see that this horn is different. It's also a little horn. Note that detail, because Daniel chapter 8 also mentions a horn that's a little horn. This horn has eyes like a man, and in the ancient world, eyes represented intelligence and craftiness. And the Bible also uses this. The eyes are the windows into the soul, if you will. I'm paraphrasing, of course. But 2 Chronicles chapter 16 tells us that the eyes of the Lord run to and fro throughout the earth. And the horn also has eyes. This is a very different empire than all the rest of them are. It speaks pompous words. Now, of course, the old King James Version talks about how it speaks great things. And we're going to see exactly what this is talking about in just a moment. So what in the world does this little horn represent? It actually proves to be the very same thing as the beast of Revelation 13. But what exactly is it? Now remember, no jumping to conclusions and no running ahead. And of course, keep your eyes on Christ in all of this. We need to gather all the evidence from the pages of the Bible and then make sure that we're reading it in its context. There are 3 things that we already know about this horn. First of all, it shall be a kingdom among the barbarians. In other words, the tribes that made their territories out of the Western Roman Empire. Secondly, it would appear after 476 AD. That's when the Western Roman Empire collapsed, and all of these divisions were then there. So this is something that rises to power after that happens. What else do we see happen? We're told that it destroys 3 of those 10 horns. So now let's look at one more clue. He shall be different from the first ones and shall subdue 3 kings. So what is our 4th point? But it is a different kingdom. And what is our 5th clue that we're going to look at? He shall speak pompous words against the Most High. And what is it that some of those pompous words are? Well, Revelation 13 tells us, referring to this same thing, he was given a mouth speaking great things and blasphemies. Well, friends, that blasphemies, that gives us a tremendous insight into what it is, the great words that this little horn is speaking. In fact, if you're not sure what blasphemy is, the Bible gives us a definition. Here in John chapter 10, it says that the Jews answered him, talking to Jesus, saying, "For a good work we do not stone you." In other words, throw stones to kill him. "But for blasphemy, and because you, being a man, make yourself God." That is the biblical definition of blasphemy. Now, friends, for Jesus, that's not blasphemy. Because why? Jesus is God. He is the creator of all things that we understand and know. He is the giver of life. He is the source of life, and he is the source of our salvation. For him to be able to take upon himself the attributes of God is not blasphemy. Aside from that, elsewhere in the scriptures, Jesus has charges hurled at him for blasphemy again because he forgives sins. And who can forgive sins but God himself? Well, again, this was not blasphemy for Jesus to do this because he had every right to do it. Now look also at what we see here in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. Who opposes and exalts himself above all that is called God or that is worshipped, so that he sits as God in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. And this is in reference to the Antichrist power. So friends, the little horn that we're looking at in Daniel and in Revelation, what we're seeing described here in 2 Thessalonians, these are all the same thing. Every one of these things are pointing to the same thing so that we can know exactly what we are looking at. And then, of course, we have, like I said, this text from Mark chapter 2, again, of why does this man speak blasphemies like this? Who can forgive sins but God alone? So again, for Christ to do these things and to take upon himself the prerogatives of God is not blasphemy because he is God. He is divinity. We, however, are mere mortals, and none of us have the right to do this. However, what this tells us is that this kingdom is different in many different ways. One of which is that it is a kingdom that speaks great words or blasphemies, which means that it's more than just a political power, it is also a religious power. What else? One more clue here back in Daniel chapter 7. He shall speak pompous words against the Most High, shall persecute the saints of the Most High. Now we'll look again at the similarities between what we're looking at in Daniel 7 and again in Revelation 13. It was granted to him to make war with the saints and to overcome them. So the descriptions are uncannily close, aren't they? In fact, they're pretty much the same thing. They might use some slightly different words, but they are describing the exact same thing. So what we see is not only is this a different kind of a kingdom, it is a kingdom that has political and religious power, but it persecutes the saints. It is a persecuting power. And yet there's one more clue we're going to look at. He shall speak pompous words against the Most High, shall persecute the saints of the Most High, and, this is a big one, shall intend to change times and law. Now, friends, we kind of looked at this a little bit the past 2 nights, but we're going to get a little bit further with this as well. But what is it? It's a kingdom that's different. It has religious clout. It has political clout. It persecutes people. And what else does it look to do? But it looks to change times and law. Now, friends, this is not talking about man's law. Man's laws change all the time. Anytime you see lawmakers in Washington who are putting together some new bill, every single time they put loopholes in every one of those laws. Why? So that they can find ways around the very laws that they're trying to enforce upon you. So whether this can't be referring to man's laws because man's laws are always weak. They are always changeable. There's always ways around them. It's intentionally designed that way. However, whose law is really the one that is important enough that God himself in this vision is making the statement that this is a power that would seek to change times and laws. This refers directly and specifically to God's law, because that's the only one that is truly unchangeable and it does not have loopholes to it. There's no getting around the simple command not to commit murder. I don't read it myself where it says, thou shalt not commit murder unless ... I personally have never seen that before. Thou shalt not commit adultery except ... Most Bibles don't have those kinds of exceptions to them because God's law doesn't change. But this is a power that would seek to change God's law and the times contained within it as well. And there's one more point that we're going to look at. Then the saints shall be given into his hands for, and this is another big one, time and times and half a time. Now, this is a bit difficult to kind of wrestle with a little bit. The imagery that's being used here, the way this is worded, time, times, and half time. This isn't language that we really use today, but the Bible defines for us how it is that we can understand this. If you recall from Daniel chapter 4, this is the story where Nebuchadnezzar kind of loses his mind for 7 years. And it's because God says, I'm going to humble you. You're going to act like a beast and eat grass and dew and all that kind of stuff. And at the end of that point in time, it tells us that after 7 times passed over him, the 7 years passed over him. Okay, so time being used this way is a representation of a year. So times then would be 2 years, and then half a time would be a half a year. So time, times, and half a time is 3.5 years. But yet there's a little bit more to this. And we're also going to see this come up again also in Revelation chapter 13. Take a look at this. And he was given authority to continue for 42 months. Now, I need you to strap your thinking cap on for just a moment. I have a graph that I'm going to show you this shortly, but I need you to think about this first. The Jewish calendar was not and is not exactly the same as ours. We use a calendar of 365 days. Now, of course, the actual year is 365 and 1 quarter. So how do we make up for that 1 quarter day? But every 4 years we have a leap year where we add in an extra day to make up for that time. The Jewish calendar was based on a lunar cycle, and that is the moon traveling around the earth. Now, this is pretty tricky because it's not exact, if you will. If you look at any current Jewish calendar today, 1 month will have 29 days, the next month will have 30, the next month will have 29, the next month will have 30, and so on and so on. 29, 30, 29, 30, on and on and on and on. The reason why is because the actual lunar cycle is 29.5 days. Now, you can also see that this would not work out to 365 days in a year. It actually falls pretty short of that. So what they would do is about every 6 or 7 years roughly, they had a whole nother month that they would insert to make up for that time, just the exact same way that we do for leap year. And many, many calendars work this way. So this is nothing new. It's nothing strange. They just use, instead of their rotation around the sun, it's the moon going around the earth. That's the Jewish calendar. Now, in prophecy, though, that time, that actual time of 29.5, we just simply round it to the nearest whole number, which is 30. So now what happens when we do that? This is extraordinary when we do that. 30 days a month. 3.5 years of 30 days a month. That comes up to 42 solid months. And it also comes up to 1,260 days. So in 3 different ways, time, times, and half a time, 42 months, 1,260 days, these are all things that are referring to the exact same period of time, but it's referring to them differently. In Daniel chapter 7, this power, it's using that time, times, and half a time. 3.5 years as 360 days per year. And as we've done before, in prophecy, a day equals a year. So this is actually referring to a time period of 1,260 years. And we'll see that in just a moment. But what we can tell is that one more point of looking at identifying who this is that it is a power that would reign for 1,260 years. And we'll see that come up more specifically in Revelation. So how can we now identify? We have these several points that we're going to use. So what this is actually talking about is the Bible predicts a problem within the Christian church. This is describing the church of the Dark Ages. Now, don't forget that one of the biggest problems in the Bible is actually the people of God. What is it that we find pointed to in the Old Testament? But usually what happens is the people of God, the nation of Israel, go off in the wrong direction. How many times, over and over and over again, do we find the people of God in the Old Testament steeped into idolatry, not heeding the prophets of God, not listening to the messages that God sends them, disobeying the commandments, and being exactly what God told them not to be? Over and over and over again this happens. Well, friends, the problem doesn't change. Now it just shifts on who is the problem. Now it isn't Old Testament Israel, it's the church that started doing these very same things. Old Testament Israel started out okay, but then they faltered and they compromised. And it got to a point where they were spiritually dead. They had all the forms of religion, but they did not have the transforming power of God in their faith. Some did, but most did not. And that is exactly what we see happen to the Christian church. It starts out strong. It starts out powerful, giving a heart-burning message that transforms lives and changes people. And it eventually comes to a point where people try to persecute it to squash it down, but that doesn't work. So the devil does that age-old trick. If you can't beat him, join him. And that's what he did. And this is when paganism comes into the church. The church compromises and eventually becomes spiritually dead for the most part. And it's during this period of time that the church begins to persecute those who don't agree with it. It's amazing. It is absolutely amazing to me. We see this over and over and over again when persecutors, when the tables are turned, the persecuted, when the tables are turned, become the persecutors. We see this in history all over the time. And it's no different for Christianity. They were once the persecuted, but when it became fashionable to become a Christian, suddenly they became the persecutors. Anybody who did not agree with the establishment, well, we can't have that now, can we? We must not allow these dissenters to have their voice even heard anymore. This was the organized church of the Western Roman Empire, and it's describing how the church behaved during the Dark Ages. It's a small kingdom among the barbarians. It appears after the year 476 AD, and it destroys 3 of the 10 tribes that came out of Western Rome. So is this really what happened? Well, in the year 533 AD, Emperor Justinian, he's the one on the throne at the time, gives political authority over the West to the Bishop of Rome. Now look what ends up happening. Not everybody went with the church. So when we have all of these areas, all these different territories where the Visigoths and the Franks and the Heruli and so on, where they all exist, they didn't really agree with the direction that the church was going. And so one by one, you have the Heruli disappear, the Vandals disappear. They're all eradicated by the army of Justinian. And then eventually you have the Ostrogoths, which disappeared. That was completed in the year 538 AD. And this was when the church could now stand as the uncontested power over all of these other nations. That's when the Ostrogoths were finally removed out of the way. And 538 AD is exactly what the Bible predicted. It didn't necessarily nail down the day directly, but look at what comes after this. So we also know that this would be a different kind of kingdom. This fourth identifying point, the Bible said that the kingdom would be different from the rest. And of course, that is exactly what the Christian church was during the Dark Ages. It was a kingdom that ruled by clergy, a religious kingdom that used force to compel the conscience of the world. There was no king, there was no parliament, there was no Congress, nothing like that. It's whatever the church said, and the governments had to go along with it. And if you didn't, well, then you had a really hard time. In fact, there were actually stories of kings in those ancient days that would decide not to go along with the direction that the church was telling them to go. And so the church would know exactly who else had the potential to become a king in that area. And they would say, hey, you know what? King Henry isn't pulling his weight. So if you want to make a bid for the throne, well, then you just go right ahead and try. and we'll back you up as long as you're going to be loyal to us. And then that king who's on the throne would say, whoa, I can't have that. So then he would quickly go and side back with the church because the kings were afraid of the church. We also see that this is a power that speaks great words or speaks blasphemy. Now, I'm going to show you some things that when I first read them, the hair stood up on the back of my neck. It stood up on my arms. And I can actually almost feel it doing that very same thing right now as I'm anticipating what I'm about to show you. But just listen very carefully to these words. What again is blasphemy? The Bible tells us it's a man claiming to be God, a human being taking upon himself the prerogatives that only belong to God. Now, with that in mind, listen to these words. We hold upon this earth the place of God Almighty. Look at what else we have. There's a lot of this that we have. The Pope is not only the representative of Jesus Christ, but he is Jesus Christ himself, hidden under the veil of the flesh. This is a letter to Pope Julius II. For thou art our shepherd, thou art physician, thou art governor, thou art husbandman, thou finally art another God on earth. Whoa, my friends. If you're not saying whoa just yet, then you need to wake up and say whoa. But this is not all. Look what else we have here. I am all in all and above all, so that God himself and I, the vicar of God, have both one consistory, and I am able to do almost all that God can do. Now, friends, if this is not blasphemy, I don't know what else is. But yet, there's more. The Pope is of so great dignity and so exalted that he is not mere man, but as it were, God. The Pope is called most holy because he is rightfully presumed to be such. Hence, the Pope is crowned with a triple crown, as King of heaven and of earth and of the lower region. Moreover, the superiority that the power of the Roman pontiff by no means pertain only to heavenly things, to earthly things, and to things under the heaven, but are even over angels, than whom he is greater, so that if it were possible that the angels might err from the faith, they could be judged and excommunicated by the Pope. For he is of so great dignity and power that he forms one and the same tribune with Christ, so that whatever the Pope does seems to proceed from the mouth of God. Friends, those words are blasphemy. And here's the last one. The Pope is, as it were, God on earth. So is this a power that claims to be God? I think we just read plenty of statements that say that very same thing. And believe me when I tell you, there are so many more. But let's look at this one more aspect. It is a persecuting power. Now, you don't really have to go very far to figure out that the Church of the Middle Ages, the Roman Church, which was the only church at the time, they didn't have all of these denominations that we have today, was most certainly a persecuting power. You can go find any historical book by any atheist, and they will be happy to tell you that that's exactly what they were. In fact, they use these things to say, see how bad Christianity is? Christianity has killed millions of people, and you want me to become one? No, I want you to become a follower of Christ, not a follower of a church. The church has persecuted. Only a trio in church history will deny that. In other words, somebody who doesn't know much, they're the only ones who would say, oh no, the church hasn't persecuted anybody. Well, friends, yes, it has. It has done horrible things, horrific things. Torture chambers, where they would take people who would not side with the teachings of the church and torture them until they either died or renounced their what they called heretical ideas. In many cases, they would burn people at the stake for doing this, as you see illustrated here. The church may, by divine right, confiscate the property of heretics, imprison their persons, and condemn them to the flames. Now, friends, I'd like you to think about this for just a moment. The church of the Middle Ages was claiming to be God, specifically the pontiff, the bishop, the overseer of the whole church, that they were giving, this is God on earth, okay? And then it's saying that the church has the power to take people's property, to confiscate their homes, to throw people in prison, and to burn them at the stake. I would like to ask you one thing. Did we ever see Christ do any of that? I never saw him confiscate property from anyone. I never saw him burn anybody at the stake. And I certainly never saw Jesus throw anybody into prison. This was a time when the church was not behaving like Christ. And it should be shameful for us to have to admit, but it is true that this has happened. But we also see that it thinks to change times and laws. Now, this is something that we've kind of gone over a little bit already, but we're just going to briefly glance through this one more time so that we can see that the church of the Middle Ages does fit every single point that we have brought up here. Wherefore, no marvel if it be in my power to dispense with all things, yea, with, what is this? The precepts of Christ. Now, friends, this is a human being saying that he can get rid of the precepts of Christ should he show desire to do so. What else do we have? The Pope has the power to change times, to abrogate laws. Abrogate means to get rid of, and to dispense with all things, even the precepts of Christ. That's another one of those things where we should say, wow, since when did God ever give a human being the power to do away with his laws or with his precepts? Nowhere in Scripture is that there. Now, one of the things that they will say is, see how Christ said, whatever you retain in heaven, or retain on earth is retained in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth is loosed in heaven. That's the excuse that they use. But however, if you read it within its context, that has absolutely nothing to do with the precepts of God or Christ. It has everything to do with someone's salvation. They're erring, so you go and you talk to them, you try to get them back on the right track, but if they refuse to repent, then they are loosed from not only the church, but also from the records in heaven. That's what that is talking about. It has nothing to do with dispensing the laws or the precepts of God or of Christ. And there's one more statement that I'd like for us to read. The authority of the church could therefore not be bound to the authority of the Scriptures because the church had changed the Sabbath into Sunday, not by commandment of Christ, but by its own authority. So is this a power that would seek to change times and laws? Oh yes, my friends, it most certainly is. In fact, you can open up some Bibles and you will find, we've talked about the Sabbath being the fourth commandment. You will find that in some copies of the Ten Commandments, the Sabbath is the third commandment. Well, why is that? It's actually quite simple. What the church did is they actually took that commandment of worshiping idols and they removed it. Took it right out of the way, shifting the fourth commandment up to the third and so on, but now they only had 9 commandments. So in order to keep 10 commandments, they took the last commandment having to do with covetousness and split it in half, so now you still had 10 commandments. And there's a lot more behind this than what I'm getting into tonight. But aside from that, there's one last point that I want to talk about, and that is this 1,260 days or 260 years period. So take a look at this graph right here. Remember how I said it was when the Ostrogoths were finally done away with, that was in the year 538 AD. That's when the pontiff could take and actually start fulfilling that decree from Emperor Justinian to have political and religious power over the European nations. Well, this lasted until you go from 538 and zip down through time 1,260 years, and what is it you come to? But you come to the year 1798. Well, what is so significant about 1798? Now, if you think about it, as far as history goes, that's really not too terribly far from where we are right now. But what happened in 1798? Well, in Europe, you have something that's happening called the French Revolution, which of course some of the inspiration for the French Revolution was the American Revolution. They saw the American colonies fight back against the British and win. So somebody else said, hey, I'm going to take inspiration from that and I'm going to fight back and we're going to have the French Revolution. Napoleon Bonaparte comes into power and he has a General Berthier who marches into the Vatican, takes the Pope, who is currently seated on the throne, dethrones him and actually strips the pontiff of his power. That Pope ends up dying in captivity, and that happens in the year 1798. And that was when the church received its deadly wound and lost all of its political clout, at least at that point in time. However, it would gain back some of that political clout years later. We'll get into that later on. So this most certainly is a power that fulfilled every single one of these points. It was a small kingdom that came up amongst the barbarian tribes. It appeared after Rome fell in 476 AD. It destroyed 3 of those 10 tribes. It was a different kind of kingdom. It spoke great words and blasphemies. It persecuted the saints. It thought to change and did change, or at least as far as they thought they could, the times and laws of God, and it lasted for that period of 1,260 years uncontested until it was toppled by Napoleon and his generals. So what does this mean for us? Revelation 13, verse 3, "And I saw one of its heads as it had been mortally wounded, and his deadly wound was healed. And all the world marveled after the beast." Now, I said earlier at the beginning of this message that this was something that most of the Christian church at one point in time truly understood and agreed upon. What changed? Well, my friends, there's some things that I want to share with you for just a moment. And this is what we refer to as the Protestant Reformation. You can go back and look at the teachings of people like Martin Luther, John Calvin, William Tyndale, Huss, over and over, and many, many, many others. Every single one of those Protestant reformers pinpointed the Roman Catholic Church as this very beast power. They did all the exact same thing that I just did tonight to prove those very same points. And there's actually more to it than what we've just done. However, the church, through all of this, eventually these various movements, Tyndale and Wesley and Luther, that's where the various denominations started to come from. And the church started losing its influence and losing power over people hand over fist. They would leave the church, join these other movements, and they would eventually become like the Lutherans and the Methodists and so on and so forth. So what ended up happening? But the church called together a council, and one of the things that they said, and I've kind of briefly mentioned this before already, is they had to say, listen, people are leaving, and the church is losing money hand over fist through all of this. We need to find an alternate teaching for these prophecies that get us out of the limelight of being this beast power. And that is where they were given the charge. This one individual was given the charge to come up with a different set of teaching. He came up with what's called preterism, which is that all of the book of Revelation was fulfilled back when the city of Jerusalem was destroyed. So therefore, the church cannot possibly be this power. And Nero, he was the Antichrist. Unfortunately, the overwhelmingly vast majority of Christianity said, no, I don't really think that makes a whole lot of sense. There's too many inconsistencies with that. And that teaching has had some people who still adhere to it, but really not very many. Another idea was developed by Francisco Ribera at that very same council. Of course, he took a much longer period of time to develop this. He actually took years to develop this idea. But he finally came back to the council and said, listen, the church cannot be this power because all this stuff, all this beast power stuff comes after the church is raptured away. And again, the bulk of Christianity said, no, that doesn't make sense either. Now, this all happened in what's called the Counter-Reformation, which also happened in the early 1500s. And what ended up happening is for about 300 years, the majority of Christianity didn't agree with either of those ideas. They continued to view this power that we just talked about as the Roman Church, until somebody comes along. One of those individuals by the name of Scofield takes these very same ideas. John Nelson Darby was also one of those same individuals, takes these ideas and popularizes them. Then you start to have a few people who make books about it and they make movies about it. Suddenly it's the most popular idea on the face of the earth when it comes to the second coming of Christ and the rapture and the church, and all this kind of stuff doesn't come until after the church. So you know what? You don't need to worry about the Antichrist because that is all after the church is gone. Don't even go bother looking for the Antichrist. Don't bother with any of that. It means nothing to you because it's all going to start after the church is whisked away into heaven. And we're going to be in paradise for 7 years while the earth is falling apart at the seams through the Antichrist and all that kind of stuff. But friends, that is all a lie. All of it is. The truth is this. The Antichrist is already here and has been here for a very long time. The beast power has also been here for a very long time, and there is more to it than what we have looked at tonight. We're going to get into that again later on to get further into these details. But ultimately, our big lesson is this. All of these things happened for no other reason than because the church took their eyes off Christ. And friends, that is what we need to keep our eyes on, is Christ. You and I have a choice to make. When the church followed the dragon, because remember in Revelation 13, it's the dragon that gives this power its authority. When the church decided to follow the dragon, and of course we've already also determined that the dragon is Satan, it made some big compromises and some huge mistakes. And the cause of Christ suffered greatly because of it. You and I can't afford to make that same kind of mistake again. If you want to be safe in these last days, then you need to follow the Lamb of God wherever the Lamb goes. Just like what's described as that special group of people in Revelation chapter 14 that follow the Lamb wherever he goes. Let me ask you tonight, who are you following now? If you're not following Christ, you are following Satan. You might be saying, wait a minute, I'm not worshiping Satan. How can you say that I'd be following Satan if I'm not following Christ? Well, if you're not following Christ, then you're following yourself. And that is exactly what Satan did. Putting his own prerogatives above the precepts and commandments of God. Friends, don't let that be your choice. Christ has extended the gift of salvation to you through his blood. He has pointed out all the errors that the church would make over time, and he's doing that, A, so we can see it happen, but so that we can also avoid making those same kinds of mistakes. And the option is laid bare for you tonight, right now, to accept the blood of Christ as your Savior, to follow the Lamb wherever it goes, and to cast aside tradition and teachings of men that don't line up with the clear "it is written" of the Bible. Thank you for joining us for In the Scriptures today. It has been our pleasure to have been a part of your day today. If there is anything that you would like to contact us about, or a question that you have regarding anything that is covered on In the Scriptures, then I invite you to connect with us by sending us an email to contact@inthescriptures.com. That's contact@inthescriptures.com. We also have a free offer this month that comes to us from the ministry It Is Written and is titled, Why Does God Allow Suffering? If you would like your free copy of this study guide, then you can again use that same email address of contact@inthescriptures.com and let us know how to get your free copy of Why Does God Allow Suffering into your hands. Additionally, if you would like to receive a DVD copy of this program, then again you can use that same email address of contact@inthescriptures.com and let us know where to send your DVD to. We look forward to hearing from you and engaging in an uplifting dialogue where we explore the Scriptures together and, most importantly, where Christ is glorified. Once again, that email address is contact@inthescriptures.com. Thank you again for watching. Have a wonderful and Christ-centered day. Tucson, Arizona hosts the 309th Aerospace Maintenance and Regeneration Group, where over 4,000 aircraft from all branches of the U.S. government are stored for various reasons and lengths of time. While some aircraft are salvaged for parts, others are kept with the intent to be used again. These aircraft go through a detailed process for their storage and then require another lengthy process to bring them back into operational condition. All this takes time, but the Bible tells us of someone that is ever at the ready. The book of Hebrews tells us that Jesus ever lives to make intercession for us. This means that he is constantly in a state of readiness to stand on our behalf and defend us as one of his own. Take the time today to make Jesus your great defender by making him your Savior. I'm Craig Fish, and let's remember to live every day according to what is in the Scriptures.